All right, so we are in chapter 5 today, and what we're going to see as we get into this chapter is we just came from an area of victory. They made it through this all of chapter 4, and we see that they have victory over multiple different kinds of opposition. They're ridiculed, they're threatened, there's a potential attack, and Nehemiah is able to unify the people. He's able to refocus them on God, and they have this great victory. And you get to the end of the chapter, and they're holding their sword, and they're holding their trowel, and they're working, and they're ready to go. And you kind of get a sense that they're re-energized and everything is going well. When we get to the beginning of chapter 5, and from all appearances, that is completely forgotten. The victory is completely erased by this next opposition that moves in. And we see that this is an opposition against their Jewish brethren. So what this was opposition in the form of disunity and division. This was infighting among God's people, and it caused way more damage than any kind of opposition that we saw in the last chapter. So we saw ridicule. Nehemiah didn't even stop. He just continued to pray. We get the idea that he probably continued to pray as he was working. Like there wasn't even any stop to the work. The threats, they didn't stop the work. They just simply equipped him with weapons and, hey, keep going. What we see is that there, at bare minimum, there is some stop to the work that happens here. One author said, if the devil can't beat you, he'll join you. So if he can't oppress the church from the outside, he'll join the church from the inside. And then another guy, I love this, is when the devil causes division among God's people, he stays neutral and he just supplies ammunition to both sides. And that's kind of a picture of what we get here. And it's crazy because what we see is that if Nehemiah and the people had not succeeded in dealing with this problem of disunity, the work of God would have been completely stopped without a single arrow being fired by the enemy, without a single sword being lifted by the enemy. In a physical sense, the work of God would have been halted. This is kind of the kicker here. Sin can be more destructive to the work of God than any outside opposition. We're going to see that sin succeeded where mockery, laughter, intimidation, death threats, all these things failed. Sin succeeded in stopping the work of God.
So sin can be more destructive to the work of God than any oppression?
Sin can be more destructive to the work of God than any outside opposition. And compromise can bring the execution of a vision to standstill. So first we're going to look at the context of sin here. And that's in the first, briefly what this chapter looks like is we're going to look at the context of sin, we're going to look at the confrontation of sin, and then we're going to look at the correction of sin. And then I'm going to look at the person of Nehemiah a little bit because I absolutely love this chapter and the way he's displayed and the leadership that he has. I'm really stoked I get to teach this because it's awesome. Anyway, reading from verse 1, we're going to read from verse 1 to verse 5. And there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against their Jewish brethren. So you know things have gotten serious now because the wives were involved. A joke, but also serious because wives would have been quiet at that point in time because this was a very male-dominated society. So the fact that we do see the wives involved, that was an indication that this was a real problem. For there were those who said, our sons and our daughters are many, therefore let us get grain that we may eat and live. And there were some who said, we have mortgaged our lands and our vineyards and houses that we may buy grain because of the famine. And there were those who said, we have borrowed money from the king for the king's tax on lands and vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren. our children as their children. And indeed, we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have been bought into slavery. It is not in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards. So, there's two parts to this. First, we see the revealed problem. We see the surface problem. And this is a mess. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that's going on here. You got a lack of food. You got some kind of a famine. You have heavy taxes. And you have deep, deep debt. And then with debt comes debtors. So we got a whole bunch of things going on here. Really at the core of the issue is you kind of have money. And to me, it's somewhat ironic that you have this building project, and a lot of times you expect money to be a problem in a building project. But this project is actually paid for already by the king, and yet you still run into some kind of money problems. That's just an aside there. But so we see four groups of people here. We have the first group who has large families, but they don't have any land, and they need to buy food. So if you kind of read into the situation, this is the jewelers, the perfumers, the hairdressers, and whatever the fourth one is that Mark always says. These are the guys that we see in chapter 3, the people that would have been working in the city who didn't own land, who had now devoted all their time to working on the wall, to ministry, and so they didn't have any time to provide for themselves. These were the exact guys that you saw that were most faithful in back in chapter 3. These are the ones that now are saying, hey, we're going to die if we don't get food. And you have a second group of people here, those who had mortgaged their properties in order to buy food and deal with this huge amount of inflation that had happened because of a famine. We don't know exactly what the famine is from. It could have been from overpopulation due to an increase of people to build the wall. Could have been just a weather famine, a lack of rain. Whatever it was, there was incredible inflation to the price of food at the time. And so these people basically had to say, hey, we'll offer our properties up as collateral here if you will give us money so that we can buy food. So I had to look up what a mortgage was so that I basically understood. Basically, you're saying, hey, I will put my land up, and if I default on my loan, then you can take my land. That's essentially what a mortgage is. We got this third group of people, and it seems like the third group of people is actually a subset of the second group of people, based on the end of verse 5. But these people had basically borrowed money to pay taxes on the land that they owned, and because they had defaulted on those loans, they had put their children up for collateral on those loans. And so now that they had defaulted on the loans, their children were going into slavery to pay off the loans that they had. And you can see at the end of verse 5, because other men have our lands and vineyards. So these were also probably the people who had mortgaged their land as well. So they were in serious trouble. Their lands had been repossessed, and then essentially their children had been repossessed as well, because they had defaulted on their loans. And then the fourth group of people is kind of implied here. There's debtors, obviously, because you have all these debts. There were Jews. We see that they were the brethren who were collecting interest, and they were selling their brothers into slavery. So you have four groups of people who are in trouble here. And we can kind of see at the end of verse 5 what the actual issue is. So we looked at the revealed issue, the surface issue. What the real issue is, though, we can see in verse 5. It is not in our power to redeem them. And first off, this is such a cool picture of our lives without Christ in it. It is not in our power to redeem ourselves. And that phrase, in our power, it literally means the strength of our hands. It is not in our strength, it is not in our capability to redeem these people. And we talked about in the last chapter that you can deliver truth in a discouraging manner. And that's what you see here. They're delivering truth. Hey, we can't redeem them. We don't have the money to redeem them. But they're doing it in a discouraging manner. If their response should have been, hey, we don't have the power to redeem them, but that's okay because God can. We don't have the power to buy them back, but hey, our God is fighting for us. See how that completely changes? Even though you have truth, it goes from discouraging to encouraging. But the issue here is they had forgotten that God was involved. They had lost the plot again. Psalm 107, 13 through 14 says, "Then they cried out to the Lord in their distress, and he saved them out of their distress. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death, and he broke their chains in pieces." They forgot that God was the one who redeems. God is the one who breaks chains. So the underlying issue here was not food. It wasn't money. It wasn't taxes. It wasn't famine. It wasn't debt. It was a loss of perspective. The underlying issue here was a loss of perspective. And we see both the people and the nobles had lost their focus again. Interestingly enough, the only person to mention God in this chapter is Nehemiah. He's the only one who stays on focus. And really, Nehemiah's focus and his unflinching sense of God at the center of everything is the only thing that saves the unity in this chapter. And we're going to see that in a minute. See, the people had forgot that God is the one who provides. They had forgot that he was the great I am. Bless you.
Thank you.
Even though they were actively doing God's work, they participated in the work that God had for them, they were not trusting him to provide. And instead, they had gone off and done it their own way. And you do have to take a careful line here, because I'm not saying taking a loan is necessarily the wrong thing. So me and Mackenzie, we've been in kind of a, our wallet's been tight lately, we'll put it that way. God's been taking us through a time where we don't have a lot financially. And a couple weeks ago, we were at a point where we had probably $100 in our account, something like that, which is fine. God is the one who provides, and it's all good. But we had to pay for our camp outreach, and that was like $600 New Zealand, and we didn't have the money. So one of our friends, he supports us, and he's like, "Hey, I'm gonna give you guys $1,000." We're like, "Sweet, God provides, awesome." But as that transaction came through, it actually got lost in the. Not entirely sure how it happened, but it got lost in the financial system. Essentially, that we talked to the bank and everything, and they're like, "Yeah, you'll probably get your money back in about 2 weeks." Well, this was like, I don't know, a week ago. So basically, that was out of the question. It wasn't going to help us for the outreach. And we're like, "God, what are you doing? Like, you provided, then you took away. Like, what are we supposed to do?" So we had two options there. We could have gone down to BNZ and got a loan for the money that we needed. We could have taken matters into our own hands and provided for ourselves and said, "Hey, God provided the bank so that we could, get this loan and provide for ourselves in a way." But we strongly believe that we are doing God's work and God is going to provide for us in this. And so we decided to wait on God's provision. And so 3 days ago, my mom calls me up. "Hey, I'm depositing $450 in your account. Someone anonymously donated to you guys." $450 is almost to the dollar $600 New Zealand. It's pretty cool. We decided to wait on God, and God came through. And that's kind of what the people had forgot here. They had forgot that they were doing God's work, and so God was going to provide for them. And so they had gone off and done it their own way, and that's why they got in this mess. The other people that had lost the sight were the nobles, and they had forgotten the most important commandment. In Matthew 22, Jesus says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your wallet." It's implied there as well. And the second commandment is this: hey, you should love your neighbor as yourself. So he says, hey, you got to get this relationship right vertically, and then you need to have your relationships right horizontally. But they had lost the plot vertically. They forgot to love God first because they were knowingly disobeying God's law. And we're going to look at that in a second. They were disobeying multiple laws knowingly. They had lost this vertical sight, and so their relationships horizontally, they were falling apart as well. They forgot to love God, and so they stopped loving people as well. So check this out. Here's the point here. When we focus on God, we stop loving one another, and we sacrifice unity on the altar of selfishness. When we lose focus on God, when we lose our perspective on who's in control, we stop loving one another, and we sacrifice unity on the altar of selfishness. And we're going to see the consequence of sin here was disunity among God's people and a halt to God's work. So in verse 6, we get to see Nehemiah's reaction to what has happened. Verse 6 through 11, "And I became very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. After serious thought, I rebuked the nobles and the rulers and said to them, 'Each of you is extracting usury from his brother.' So I called a great assembly against them, and I said to them, 'According to our ability, we have redeemed our Jewish brethren who were sold to the nations. Now indeed, will you even sell your brothers, or should they be sold to us?' Then they were silenced and found nothing to say. And I said, 'What you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of God because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies? I also with my brothers and servants am lending them money and grain. Please let us stop this usury. Restore to them even this day the lands and their vineyards and their olive groves and their houses, and also 100th of the grain and the new wine and the oil that you have charged them.'" So we see here in this section, we see the confrontation of sin. In the last section, we saw the context of sin, and now we're going to see the confrontation of sin. And first, we got the method of confrontation. Nehemiah had a passionate reaction here. He had a passionate reaction. "I became very angry." So guys, pay attention to the things that make you angry. Pay attention to the things that cause you to react passionately, because a lot of the time, those are going to be indicative of God's burden on your life. See, passion indicates both calling and vision. Where God impassions you is most often where God's going to call you and where he's going to give you vision. That word very angry there, it means to kindle, to burn with anger, and to become enraged. See, he was upset at what he had heard. And check it out, it's twofold here. So he was upset first at their outcry. So he was upset that they were being oppressed. He was upset that they were suffering. He cared about the people, and so he was upset. And the second part is he was upset because of the words they said. He was upset because there was sin going on among God's people. So he was upset that they were suffering, and he's upset that there was sin. And it's pretty interesting because that word, very angry, it's actually the exact same word used in chapter 4, verse 1, when Nehemiah describes Sanballat's reaction to the wall being built. So you have a pretty crazy dichotomy here. You have Sanballat getting angry, burning with rage because God's work was being done, And then you have the righteous anger of Nehemiah, who was angry because God's work was halted and because there was disunity among God's people. See, Nehemiah was not a politician who asked what's popular or a diplomat who said what is safe, but he was a leader who asked what is right. His anger was a holy anger against sin, and he knew that the law of God was behind him. So he had this passionate reaction. But the great thing that we see is that in spite of having a passionate reaction, he had a purposeful response. So it says, after serious thought. And this is such a cool example of self-control that we have here. He literally is enraged and burning with anger, and yet he has the wisdom to sit back and think about the situation before he acts and answers. He was passionate enough to become enraged, but he was wise enough to consider and think before he acted and spoke. Man, that's such a practical leadership application that we have here. Get angry at the things that God gets angry at. Get angry at those things that are wrongful, at people suffering. But sit back and consider before you take action. Mark always tells a story like he'll get emails all the time where he gets really upset when he reads the email. And it's great to hear him describe like how angry he is when he gets some of these emails. But his rule that he has is he will write a response to that email right then, but he will wait 3 days to send the response out, and he'll reread the response that he wrote 3 days later after he's had a chance to calm down and think about the situation. And that's a great example of leadership. Be passionate, but also think. Proverbs 29:11 says, "Fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end." And this is a really cool chapter too, because there are so many scriptures that line up directly with the way Nehemiah responded in this passage. Just absolutely directly. I mean, you see here, if he had given full vent to his rage, the people wouldn't have responded well. We wouldn't have seen the same acceptance of confrontation that we're going to see. But he sat back and he waited. And that word for serious thought there it's pretty cool. It actually is to have a conference about something. So what this literally translates to is, my heart consulted within me. Nehemiah reconciled his emotions with his thoughts. He had a conference between his heart and his mind before he acted. So me and Mackenzie and I, we have this thing. I'm just realizing I have a lot of Mackenzie and I examples this morning, but hopefully, whatever. So we have this thing in our relationship. If we get angry with each other, that very rarely happens. But if we get really irritated or passionate about something that we're talking about, and we feel like there's a chance that we'll say something that we regret, we have a pause button. And so we'll say, if we're in the middle of a conversation, and I do this more often, if I feel like I'm on the edge of saying something that is not reflective of how I actually feel, and it's just an emotional response, I'll say, hey, let's put this on pause and talk about it again in 2 hours. And I'll sit back and I'll consider what the situation is, think about it, allow myself to calm down, and then we'll reconvene the conversation. And that avoids so many issues with saying things that you are going to regret at a later point in time, because it allows you to sit back and consider. But what we see with Nehemiah here is that he sat back and considered, but he didn't let his thinking overcome action. So we see, I rebuked the nobles and rulers. He wasn't a coward. He allowed his passion to marry with his thoughts, and then he took action. He confronted them. So we see that you have the method of confrontation, and then you have the purpose of confrontation. And I don't want to make this, I don't think There's a lot of ways you could go with this chapter, and I didn't want to make this about confrontation. I didn't think that was quite the way that God was leading me this morning. But you do see one thing really clearly in this passage, and it's that Nehemiah clearly exposes the wrong here. He doesn't beat around the bush. He hits this head on, and he tells them exactly what they're doing wrong. In verse 7, we see he says, you are charging usury. For those of you who don't know, usury is basically just a really high interest rate. So he's saying you are charging a high interest rate on your brothers. And the issue here is this is in direct opposition to Mosaic law. So in Exodus 22:25 it says, if you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like a money lender to him. You shall not charge him interest. So not only should you not charge them exorbitant interest, but you should not charge them interest at all if they're in a place where they're poor. Even further, we see in Deuteronomy 23:19, you shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money or food or anything that is lent. To a foreigner charge them interest, but to your brother you shall not charge interest. Check this out. That the Lord your God may bless you in all that you set your hand to. So in Deuteronomy it says, hey, don't charge your brother interest. Don't enact usury on them. And here's the reason why, because God's going to provide for you. He wants to bless you in this. You're not going to be operating in the red because you're not charging interest. God's going to bless your faithfulness in this time. And what that does, and we're going to see time and time again throughout this chapter that God wants to set his people apart. And that's the exact reason that Nehemiah is rebuilding the wall in the first place, is because God needs the glory. And part of this is God wanted a people who were set apart to give him glory. And part of that was to the nations. And so he says, hey, don't operate like the nations. Don't charge your brother interest. You're going to be a separate people for me, and I'm going to bless you through this. People are going to look at you and say, what are they doing over there? How are they so... how are they making ends meet if they're not operating like we are and cheating our brothers? But God's going to bless them in that situation. So he said, hey, you're charging them usury. That's wrong. It's against God's will. It's against his law. Verse 8, we see the second part is you're enslaving your brothers. And that, again, is outlawed in Mosaic law. Leviticus 25 says, if one of your brothers becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear God, that your brother may live with you. There's the motivation again, but fear God. You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him any food for profit. And again, I love this. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you to the land of Canaan and be your God. So he says, hey, you're not going to charge interest. You're not going to charge usury. I am the Lord your God. I provided manna in the desert. I brought you out of Egypt. I'm going to provide for you now. I love that he frames it that way. And then he goes on in verse 39. And if one of your brothers who dwells with you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant or as a sojourner he shall be to you, and he shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. Note that. And then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. So he's saying, hey, why are you guys enslaving your brothers? It's against the law. You're charging interest, which is wrong. You're enslaving your brothers, which is wrong. Man, this is the kicker. He says, now indeed, will you even sell your brethren, or should they be sold to us? You say, what is he saying there? Here it is in modern day speech. Nehemiah is saying, dude, are you serious right now? Are you kidding me? You are selling the very people that we are trying to redeem. We just bought these people back and you're selling them into slavery? What are you doing? Do you want us to purchase the very people that you're selling into slavery? This is exactly why we're in this mess in the first place. What are you doing? See, the reason for that year of Jubilee that I just said to take note of was that it balanced the economic system in Israel so that the rich didn't get continually richer and the poor got continually poorer. All the debts had to be forgiven, all the land restored, and all the servants set free on every seventh year. Remember when Mark talked about, hey, they weren't doing this, and so they had to go into slavery for 70 years because of that time? This is what it's talking about. So Nehemiah is saying, what on earth are you guys doing? This is exactly why we were taken into captivity in the first place. And now you're doing this again? Plus, we're buying these guys back. He must have been so upset at this point. It's amazing that he didn't react in anger. In verse 9, we see the third reason. So, hey, it's against the law to charge usury. It's against the law to enslave your brothers. And in verse 9, it's wrong. What you're doing is not right. It is not according to God's character. You are acting wrongly. In verse 9 also, we see, here's the two really important parts. So, hey, it's against the law. You're acting wrongly. It's not in accord with God's character. Here's the underlying thing that we talked about. This is the true motivation. It displays a lack of fear of God. Hey, you guys are not fearing God in this. Here's the important part. So, throughout this whole book, Nehemiah continually refocuses on God. We talked about perspective. He continually brings the perspective back to God. And here it is. Here's where he brings the perspective back to God. Hey, you are not fearing God in this. Warren Worsby puts it this way. To fear the Lord means to seek to glorify God in everything we do. To fear the Lord means to seek to glorify God in everything we do. It means listening to his word, honoring it, and obeying it. So he's saying, hey, you guys are not glorifying God. You're not honoring his word. That's the important part here. And along with that, it's a bad testimony to those around us. It's a bad testimony to those around us. He's saying here, guys, this is exactly why we are building the wall in the first place. We are trying to give God glory, and you are tarnishing the glory of God that we're seeking to restore through selling your brothers to those around us. You're tarnishing it. How could some of the Jewish citizens build the city wall on the one hand while enslaving their neighbors on the other? If we truly fear God, then we will want to honor him before those who don't believe in him. So you can imagine here Sanballat and Tobiah sitting on the outside. Look at these morons. They're trying to build the wall here, but they're selling their own brothers into slavery? I mean, if they were laughing at anything, they were laughing right now at what was going on. And Nehemiah points that out. He said, hey, this is a terrible testimony. You're not only not contributing to the glory of God, but you're actually detracting from it. And that's the underlying motivation of the confrontation that Nehemiah has here, is that God is not being glorified. So we see that he clearly points out the wrong. He shows what's in violation of the Mosaic law. He shows that it's in violation of God's character. And he says, hey, it doesn't display a lack of fear of God, and it's a bad testimony to those around us. And so we see the response to the confrontation. And this is a amazing response to confrontation. It's beautiful. The wrongdoers responded with, first, no excuses. In verse 8, it says, and they were silenced. See, true conviction from God tends to eliminate excuses and silence protest. True conviction from God tends to eliminate excuses and silence protests. They had no excuses. They were silenced. Second, they didn't negotiate. They didn't say, hey, all right, well, we'll give them 5% back, and we'll give them half of their lands back. And, we're going to keep the daughters because they're pretty cute, but we'll give them the sons back because they're a pain in the butt. They didn't negotiate. Verse 12, we will restore it. We will restore it. Nehemiah confronted these men in a godly manner. He refocused them on God, and they accepted the correction. They didn't try to get around it. And then finally, there was no delays. They didn't set up a plan. They didn't decide, hey, we'll restore this in 5 years. We'll build up to it. No, they did it. In verse 13, it says, sorry, I lost my place. Verse 13. Then the people did according to the promise. They did according to the promise. So we see this beautiful response to confrontation. They didn't give excuses, they didn't negotiate, and they didn't delay. They just fixed it. So we saw the context of sin, the confrontation of sin, and here's the correction of sin. And this is what I wanted to get to, because I love this. This is beautiful. In verse 12 and 13, so they said, we will restore it, and will require nothing from them. We will do as you say. So I called the priests and required an oath from them that they would do according to this promise. Then I shook out the fold of my garment and said, so may God shake each man from his house and from his property who does not perform this promise. Even thus may he be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said, Amen. And they praised God. Then the people did according to this promise. So we see an awesome example of a correction of sin here. And this is so simple and so practical. I wish I had this laid out to me like this 10 years ago. And we're gonna look at the steps to stopping sin. There's 4, and they're all incredibly simple. The first one, stop. First one is stop. Stop it now. Don't avoid your sin problem. Deal with it. Deal with it. Notice what they don't do. They don't go and think about it. They don't go and consider, hey, I'm going to go read some scripture about this and kind of. They don't do that. They don't make any plans. There's not a 5-year plan to return the land, to return the kids. They don't go seek counseling. Hey, I'm going to go, I'm going to set up an appointment with my pastor in a week to kind of talk about this. They don't do that. They deal with it. They deal with the sin before God that day. Chuck Swindoll puts it this way. Making long-range plans to correct a problem allows the sands of time to hone off the raw edges of God's reproof in your life. Making long-range plans to correct a problem allows the sands of time to hone off the raw edges of God's reproof in your life. We end up tolerating that sin and perhaps even protecting it.
One more time.
Making long-range plans to correct a problem allows the sands of time to hone off the raw edges of God's reproof in our lives. We end up tolerating that sin and perhaps even protecting it. And he goes on to say in that same passage, prolonged personal sin takes a heavy toll on God's work in your life. Willfully decide to eliminate the wrongdoing right now. You cannot gradually stop sinning. You cannot gradually stop sinning. So, I used to have an eating problem. I don't know if probably none of you guys knew that. And this was a number of years ago. I would, and it's actually a pretty common problem. It's like cyclical eating. So you'll eat super, super healthy for whatever, a certain amount of time, and then you just binge eat for it's usually just one meal or something. And I'd get like 2 pizzas and a full tray of Oreos, and I'd eat all of it, like no problem. But I would eat to the point where I was like painfully full, and I don't know scripturally necessarily if this was, I would say it's probably gluttony, but regardless, I was convicted that it was sinful. But the issue was I never took action while I was sinning. I would participate in the sin, and then I would feel guilty at the time, but I wouldn't do anything. And as time went on, the guilt would go down, kind of thing. It would not be as vivid. As the feeling of fullness went away, the feeling of guilt went away, and my motivation to take action would go away as well. And the next day I would come and I'd be like, it's fine, I just won't do it again. But I didn't take any kind of steps towards correcting the problem. And that was the issue. See, when you have that feeling of guilt, when guilt flares and the conscience burns, that's when you take action to fix your sin. Not 2 days from now, not tomorrow, not in a couple hours. When you have that guilt, that's the Holy Spirit working on your conscience. That's when you take action to correct sin. So the first step to stopping sin, stop it. Stop it now, right now. The second part, fix it. If it is in your power, fix the problem you created. Sometimes that's not going to be the case. If this is a personal sin for you, or me, or whatever, then you may not be able to fix it, or there may not be anything that necessarily needs to be fixed. But if this is an interpersonal kind of sin, if this is a corporate sin, there's always going to be someone that you need to apologize to. So if it's in your power, fix the problem. See, restoration is impossible without restitution. Restoration is impossible without restitution. You cannot have restored unity until you make amends for the problem. So if these guys had accepted what Nehemiah said, you're right, probably shouldn't have bought these guys out and sold them into slavery. That was probably not a good thing. We're really sorry. And then they just left. There's no unity that would have been restored there. They still had the kids in slavery. You have to take steps to correct the wrong before unity can be restored. An apology is meaningless without any action to back it up. So stop sinning now. Fix the problem if you're able. And this is absolutely critical. Possibly, if you take nothing else out of today, take this. If you're struggling with sin and you want to fix it, get accountability. Get accountability. And I speak from experience here. If you're struggling with sin and you want to fix it, get accountability. Check out what Nehemiah does here. Then I called the priests, and the priests here were representatives of God in this situation. I called the priests, and I required an oath of the people. Nehemiah recognized that the only way to ensure the nobles would do what they promised was through accountability. This was wise leadership on his part. He knew that if he made them swear before God to agree to do all that they had said, then that was the only way that they would do it. And this wasn't necessarily a distrust of the nobles. This was a recognition of human nature. Jesus says in Mark 14, watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And accountability is put in place to allow you to act on what the spirit is willing to do, but that the flesh doesn't want to. second part of this is he made the promise public so that people could hold them accountable as well. So not only were they accountable before God in this, but they were accountable to everyone else that was there. This was a public promise. See, a promise, especially a public one, will help you deal with your sin efficiently. In James 5:16 it says, "Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed." Why do you confess to one another? So that they can hold you accountable. And that's what leads to healing in this situation. So I said I had an eating problem. I had this binge eating. And for a long time, I didn't take steps to correct it when my conscience flared. But eventually I got to the point where I was like, God, I want to deal with this. I'm going to take steps to correct this. And so the first thing I did is I got accountable. I set up a diet contract, was what I called it. I wrote out on a piece of paper exactly what I was going to avoid. And at the top of that paper, I put, "I promise before God." And then I wrote the rest of it. And at the bottom of the paper, I put my name and I put Mackenzie's name. And we both signed it. So that did two things. That made me accountable to my wife, to my best friend, to keep me to this. And then also, it made me accountable to God, more importantly, in the situation. And that was incredibly helpful to me because I had made a promise, a public promise, and a promise that was before God to live up to what I had said I was going to do. And that's exactly what Nehemiah does here. See, accountability was put in place to help the weakness of the flesh to accomplish what the Spirit was willing to do. In Romans 7:15, this is probably one of the most frustrating verses in the Bible, I think. For what I am doing, I do not understand. I don't understand what I'm doing. This doesn't even make sense to me. For what I will to do, that I don't practice. What I want to do, I don't do. But what I hate, that's what I do. For me, it's one of the most frustrating verses in the Bible because it's so true. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that's what I do. And that's what accountability is there for, is to help you to not do what you hate and to do what you actually want to do. One of my friends really struggles with porn. And he is in the military, so he's on the other side of the planet right now. And part of my job as a friend is to hold him accountable. But that's not an easy thing to do when you're halfway around the world from someone. And so we had to come up with a solution where I could help him to be accountable before God for this problem that he has when temptation arises. So what we decided to do is he struggles with his phone. That's his issue, is when he has his phone in front of him and he's in bed or whatever. So what we did is we changed the background of his phone to my picture. We changed the background of his phone to my picture, and we put 1 Corinthians 6:18 on it, which, for those of you who know, is flee sexual immorality. And that was the background of his phone. So every time he opened up his phone, he had to see my picture, and he had to see flee sexual immorality. That's accountability. That's accountability. It allowed him, and it's been incredibly helpful, it allowed him to be accountable for his actions in a creative way. And see, if we make a promise to God, we better be ready to keep it. We better be ready to keep it. In Ecclesiastes 5:5-6, it says, "It is better to say nothing than to make a promise and not keep it. Don't let your mouth make you sin. Don't defend yourself by telling the temple messenger, by telling the priest, by telling the representative of God, that the promise you made was a mistake. That would make God angry, and he will wipe out everything that you have achieved. So if you're going to make a promise before God, you better be ready to keep it. And that leads right into the fourth part of dealing with sin. Fear the Lord. Fear the Lord. Proverbs 19:23. The fear of the Lord leads to life, so that one may sleep satisfied, untouched by evil. You want to be untouched by evil? You want to avoid sin? Fear God. You have to understand the seriousness of a commitment to the God of the universe. You have to understand the seriousness of a commitment to the God of the universe. Deuteronomy 23:21, interestingly enough, this is the verse after the verse I read earlier about not participating in usury. When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it would be sin of you not to. It'd be sin. You're literally sinning if you make a commitment before God and you don't fulfill it. So understand the seriousness of the commitment to the God of the universe. Nehemiah helped to incentivize the corrections of these nobles by cursing them, essentially, for those who did not adhere to the promises that they made. He shook out the folds of his garment. And basically, you can think of it as, hey, he had like food or crumbs on his garment and he just shook it off. Hey, if you don't do what you have promised here, God get rid of you. God shake you off your property. It was an act of condemnation. It was a complete rejection of anyone who violated this agreement. It was to help them understand the seriousness of the commitment they had made. And for us, understand the seriousness of sin. And this is something that I struggle with for years. Understand the seriousness of sin. Sin is a violation of God's character. It's a violation of God's character. At definition, sin means missing the mark. It means straying from the path. It means not being in line with who God is. And it required the death of his son. Sin required the death of his son. Understand the seriousness of sin. See, ultimately our motivation and our capability to not sin, it can only come from a fear of the Lord. Ultimately, our motivation and our capability to not sin, it can only come from a fear of the Lord. It can only come from a deep understanding of his love and an unquenchable gratitude for salvation. Alan Redpath puts it this way, and we're going to look a little further on. Nehemiah says, hey, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. He says, but I did not do so because of the love of Jesus. But I did not do so because of the love of Jesus. That is the only motive that can inspire a man to stay right with God, to keep his life pure and clean. So, if you want to deal with sin, stop it. Stop it now. Just stop. Fix it if you can. If it's in your power, fix it. Get accountability. Get accountability. However you have to do that. And fear the Lord. Fear the Lord. And we see the results of that correction. That freedom from sin. We see how beautiful this is in the end of that passage that we read. And all the assembly said, that was everyone. That was the nobles, that was the people. Everyone was in one group. All of them said, amen. And that word amen, it just means they were in agreement. Hey, let it be so. Let's do it. Right on. And then they praised the Lord. So you see, with sin erased from the picture, restoration was restored instantly. They had instant unity restored to them. And the result of that restoration of unity was praising God. Corporately praising God. What a cool thing. Nehemiah, he realigned their perspective back on God. He said, hey, this is not right before God. and he's the one that's providing for us. This is detracting from God's glory. He realigned their perspective back to God, and so the success of the confrontation led to God being glorified. The success of the confrontation led to God being glorified. Awesome. That was his motivation throughout the whole thing, and God was glorified in the end. His name was praised. And the people, we see here, they became worshipers in this. So they were workers originally. They became warriors when opposition arose. And now, with the restoration of unity, they became worshipers of God. So I just want to hit on a couple leadership observations, and then we'll close today. The first one is, because what we have in this chapter is an incredible example of leadership that Nehemiah displays. And I think this is the most powerful section so far that we get to see of Nehemiah, the most revealing. And he has an incredible character. The first thing that we can take is tackle sin head on. Tackle it head on. Nehemiah acted in a godly manner. He didn't act out of anger. He had the capability to have a passionate reaction, but he sat back and he acted in a godly manner. And God rewarded his faithfulness by restoring unity among the people. He attacked the sin problem head on, and that allowed God to restore unity among his people. See, leaders must be ready to confront sin. You have to be ready to confront sin. It is never pleasant. It is never comfortable, but you have to be ready to do it. I had a situation a while back where one of my leaders publicly was involved in sin. It was an act. He was incredibly unloving to someone else, and to the point where I had to take action. And I will tell you what, that is for any of you guys who know me, I am very non-confrontational. I really do not like conflict at all. But because I loved this leader and because I had respect for him, I had to confront him. It was the biblical thing to do. And it was one of the most uncomfortable situations of my entire life. My heart was like, I mean, he could hear it. And I confronted him in a godly manner, and guess what? He accepted it. And it was beautiful because there was restored unity in this situation. He didn't give excuses. He didn't delay, and it led to restored unity. See, leaders have to be ready to confront sin. Tackle the sin problem head on. Second is find motivation in God alone. Find your motivation in God alone. In verse 15 we read, but the former governors who were with me laid burdens on the people, and they took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. This is such a cool statement. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. So Nehemiah says, hey, I didn't act like these other rulers before me. I didn't lay burdens on the people. I didn't claim my rights to have this additional income because of the fear of God. That was my motivation in this. I want to be right before God. We see Nehemiah's ultimate motivation here. He was not concerned with man. He wasn't concerned with his own rights. He was simply concerned about the glory of God. He was concerned about being right before the God of the universe. What a cool thing. Oswald Chambers says, the remarkable thing about fearing God is that when you fear God, you fear nothing else. And whereas if you don't fear God, you fear everything else. The remarkable thing about fearing God is that when you fear God, you fear nothing else. Whereas if you don't fear God, you fear everything else. Nehemiah had his perspective correct. And in verse 19, we really see it again. Remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. Remember, this is a diary of Nehemiah. He's not saying this that other people can hear it. He's recording it. And instead of being a claim to blessing here, what this is he's saying, God, my motivation is that you see the right that I've done. Is that you see that I'm standing correct before you. His motivation was God's approval, not man's. He was only concerned with God seeing that what he was doing was correct. And this quote is awesome. I love this. Lighthouses blow no horns. They only shine. Dwight L. Moody said this. Lighthouses blow no horns. They only shine. Nehemiah didn't need to proclaim to the people, hey, this is what I'm doing right. He simply set up the example. He shined out to the people so that they could see what the example was. And that really leads into the third point on leadership here, and this is the best. This is my favorite out of the whole chapter. Maintain uncompromising integrity. Maintain uncompromising integrity. See, we get to see Nehemiah's unflinching integrity on full display in this chapter. We see it again and again and again. There are multiple examples of his character and his adherence to God's character throughout this chapter. He recognized that godly leaders refuse to compromise. They refuse to compromise. So I gave you guys the example of a camera a couple days ago, and I explained as light comes into the camera, you change that through an aperture setting, and basically you adjust your focus. It allows more light into the camera. It allows a greater vision to be seen. The other part of a camera that's really interesting is, or a DSLR, is that you have mirrors inside. There are multiple mirrors inside the camera. So light comes in through the lens, and it bounces on these mirrors, and eventually what happens is the light makes an impression that becomes an image. The light makes an impression that becomes an image. So it comes into the camera, it reflects on all these different mirrors, and eventually it's recorded as an image. The thing is, if any of those mirrors are dirty, or if they're tarnished, or if any of those mirrors even has a speck of dust on them, it's going to degrade the image quality. Even a speck of dust on one of those mirrors is going to result in a subpar image that's recorded. It'll be blurry, out of focus. And in the same way, godly leaders, they adjust their perspective on God. They change their aperture setting to allow light to flood in, but they also realize that their lives cannot be tarnished in order to reflect God to others. They realize that a proper reflection of God's character in their conduct is critical to successfully impressing vision on others. They know that there can't be that dust of sin in their lives, or God will not be reflected correctly. See, spiritual leaders are called to live lives above reproach. 1 Timothy 3:2. So a church leader must be a man whose life is above reproach. That's what we're called to as spiritual leaders. And godly leaders understand the immutable character of God. They understand that God's character doesn't change. And so they are motivated to reflect that throughout, without compromise. They're motivated to reflect God's character without compromise because they know God's character doesn't change. We see this in Daniel. Man, Daniel was a leader that did not compromise. In Daniel 6, we read, So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. They wanted to trip him up. They wanted to find something wrong. But they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful. They could find no charge or fault because he was faithful. Nor was there any error or fault found in him. You want a description of a leader who doesn't compromise? That's it right there. Not only could they not find anything wrong with him, but there was nothing to find wrong with him. He was a guy that adhered to the character of God. Joseph, another guy, in Genesis 39, we see him speaking to Potiphar's wife, and it says, "There's no one greater in this house than I. I have been elevated to the highest part of this house. And he, Potiphar, he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? He was in an incredibly tempting situation. But God was the one who had provided elevation for him. God is the one that had allowed the works of his hand to prosper. And so he doesn't say, "Oh man, how could I do this against Potiphar? He's raised me up in his house. He's put me in this position." No, he doesn't say that. He doesn't care about man's approval. He says, "How could I do this great evil and sin against God?" Joseph was a guy who had his perspective correct. And he was a leader who was not going to compromise in a situation where it would have been very easy to compromise. And we see the exact same thing throughout Nehemiah. Nehemiah didn't deal with this situation on the basis of organization or argument, but rather on the basis of a life that was absolutely beyond suspicion. Absolutely beyond suspicion. And because he, in his place of leadership, was able to face the whole company of people and say, "But I did not do so," the devil was confounded and the building of the wall went on. He was able to stand there and say, "Guys, I haven't done it. I have not participated in any of this. I haven't compromised." And God used that to confound the devil and continue to build the wall. How powerful is that? It's awesome. I have seen this power of example firsthand in my life. So when I met my wife's dad, he was very out of shape and overweight. He did not live a healthy lifestyle. He owns his own multi-million-dollar business, and it put a lot of stress on his body. And so basically he's a big dude. He was like 6'2" and probably 330 when I met him. He's a big guy. Very unhealthy. Anything he cooked, he would throw a slab of butter in. His snacks were either like a quarter tub of peanut butter or a chunk of cheddar cheese. Like he was not a healthy man. And when I met him, I was past this eating disorder already, and I was living a pretty healthy lifestyle, like more or less what I do now. Like I trained every day, I ate good. I was uncompromising in my approach to my physical health. And I never said a word to him. I never commented on his eating, never commented on his weight. I never said one word to him about his health situation. And within probably a year, I saw him go from this state of eating blocks of cheddar cheese when he was hungry to being in the gym every single day, making chicken on Sunday that he could eat throughout the rest of his week because he was doing meal planning. And it was because of my example in his life that he did that. And I never said a word. And I'm 20 years younger than him. He's a multi-million-dollar businessman. And yet my example in his life led to a complete change of his health situation. He lost like 60 pounds in 18 months or something. And it was simply because I wasn't willing to compromise in the area of health, and he saw that. And in the same way, Nehemiah was not willing to compromise in these situations. He cared for God's people. He said, hey, we've redeemed our Jewish brothers. I'm spending my own money to buy my brothers back because they are God's people and God has redeemed them. He lent in a godly manner. He was able to say, hey, I'm lending to these guys too, but I'm not charging interest. I'm not charging usury. I'm doing it right. Psalm 15:5 says, this is so cool. He who does not put out his money at usury, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent, he who does these things shall never be moved. You could rephrase that. He who does these things does not compromise. It's beautiful. And he didn't claim his rights. He led in that way. He said, hey, I know I'm the governor. I could be charging all of this interest. I could be getting 40 shekels of silver a day, but I'm not claiming that right. Neither me or my brothers ate the governor's provisions. See, he wasn't interested in his own rights. He was interested in the work of God being performed. He generously provided for others. He said, at my table are 150 Jews and all these other rulers from the kingdoms. They sit at my table every night. That's not even the parties we have. This is my dinner party every night. And I provide for them out of my own pocket. I give them, I am generously giving to these people out of my own pocket. The amount of food there that's listed, it's estimated that would feed 500 people. So, I don't know what that is. So he was providing so much food that 500 people could have eaten at his table at any given night. And that was coming out of his own pocket. He was not demanding any of the governor provisions. And then finally, the coup de grace of him being an example is he continued to work. It says, indeed, I also continued to work on the wall. See, Nehemiah inspired the people to participate in a God-given vision. He inspired them to participate in a God-given vision by leading from the front. He had a brick in his hand as he was saying this. I'm building the wall. Even as I'm doing this, I am continually doing God's work. Nothing's going to stop me from doing God's work. I refuse to compromise. Man, I want to be a person that can stand up before God and my motivation be, God, I'm right before you and I will not compromise. I won't do it. I'm going to stand right before you. I want to be that kind of a leader. So I want to give you guys one thought in conclusion. Nehemiah was a leader who refused to compromise. He was a man who fixed his focus on God. And he lived with an unyielding sense of integrity that inspired those around him. Here's the question. Here's the challenge. How many of us can say, like Nehemiah and like Paul, follow me as I follow God? How many of us can say that? And if you can't, if I can't say that, if you can't say that, identify the areas in your life where you're compromising and face them head on. Fix your sin now. Deal with your sin now. Fix it. Get accountable. Fear God. And here's my heart. Here's my dream. Let's be a people and a body and a generation whose battle cry is no compromise. Let's be a people and a body and a generation whose battle cry is no compromise. We will stand right before God. That's my heart. We will stand right before God. Lord, we love you, and we want to stand right before you. we want to be those leaders that are uncompromising. We want to be those people that the world looks to and they know who we follow. They know who is glorified in our lives. Lord, give us unity. Give us courage to face our sin, God, and give us courage to take the steps to correct it. Lord, empower us. Let us continue to do your work. Give us vision for what you have for us. And Lord, let us glorify you in everything that we do. We love you. In your name, amen.